What's up, guys? This is Nocember lecture, and it's about military in Taiwan. And I'm Riki.
And I'm
Um,
Meredith.
yeah, we're both juniors.
Yeah. Okay. The topic for this month is resolved. The United States should substantially reduce its military support of Taiwan.
Yup.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is fiat? Fiat is basically saying that the resolution will occur if you affirm. So people cannot argue that the U.S. will never agree to reducing support because that's unrealistic, guaranteed, and it's guaranteed to happen because of fiat. So fiat just basically allows for the resolution to happen no matter what.
Yeah. And so now we're going to go into the background about Taiwan and China. Or actually, first, we're going to break down the resolution. So the United States should. So this doesn't mean the federal government, it just means the United States as a whole. It's more of a moral argument, like per se, because it's what they should do. Or it doesn't have to be moral, but it's just like what's better for the United States as a whole, not necessarily the government.
Yeah.
Then substantially reduce. It doesn't tell you how much we're going to reduce from our support of Taiwan, but we do know it's going to be less military support. And we'll get into what that military support we have in the status quo is later. Military support, there's no definition provided, so it's really vague. We'll get into what we do on the next slide, but it's basically just monetary funding through arms as well as joint training activities and military education that the US has been doing for decades on end.
Yeah. Okay. So what Taiwan is, it's basically officially called the Republic of China. So don't get that confused with the People's Republic of China. And no country officially recognizes Taiwan as an independent country or region, even the USA. Like the USA doesn't recognize Taiwan as an independent country. And then some bordering nations that like are important to know, or like China and Philippines, like this slide says, but also keep in mind that South Korea, North Korea, Japan are all in this area within the South China Sea. And then a large part of Taiwan's money and economic gains come from the semiconductor industry through like electronics. And basically, if you don't know what a semiconductor is, it's used in every single technology device, especially in like AI and computers and phones. So like everyday technology that you use requires semiconductors. And one key thing to know about Taiwan is that it's largely democratic, unlike China. And basically, like in 1950 or whatever, a group of people from China left and went to Taiwan and established it.
Yeah, when the People's Republic of China was formed, or the current government of China, the Chinese Communist Party was formed. Basically the old government, the KMT government, fled to Taiwan. So they are like mostly ethnically Chinese.
Yeah.
Um, the status quo. So, like basically in the status quo, we're not allowed to have official military presence in Taiwan, considering the entire world states that it's part of China, and China wouldn't allow us to have official military presence in Taiwan. However, we do maintain unofficial military presence, such as training exercises, which we've maintained since 1979 when we stopped our official presence. Now, the ways that we maintain this presence are through the Taiwan Relations Act, which mandates US exercises to help Taiwan to maintain their military, as well as the recently passed act, the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, which strengthened our presence in the region due to Taiwanese fears that the United States would not help them in the face of a Chinese invasion. So, since the year 2008, actually, we've pretty much had permanent US troops in Taiwan, although unofficial, and that number increases by the year. The other way that we have military like presence in Taiwan is through our funding. In the past several decades, the United States has sold Taiwan $50 billion worth of defense equipment. And every year there's a $2 billion budget in defense equipment that we give them. So, like a grant, basically. However, these sales aren't just automatic. The US government has to approve them. So, if we're stating that the US government is going, or the United States as a whole is going to stop supporting Taiwan, that means the US government can cut off even private sector arms sales. So keep that in mind if you're going to be running arguments, including arms
Yeah. I
sales.
think, yeah. And then let's go into some recent news. So like these are just like recent stuff that has happened with Taiwan and stuff. So like she said, Taiwan US relations, there's been like multiple acts that have been passed. The first one is the Taiwan Relations Act. It happened in 1979, so it was kind of a while ago, and it's the U.S. law that governs relations, and it's basically the foundation that allows us to keep supporting Taiwan, even though we don't recognize them as a total like state or country yet. And it's allowed commercial slash cultural relations with them, so that's why we support like Taiwanese like cultural relations and stuff like that. And it's also the legal basis for providing military support. So since 1979 we've started to give them like military support and whatnot, like things like that. And then the second act is the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, and it happened in 2022 under the Biden administration. And it was just a U.S. law to strengthen the Taiwan Relations Act, and it like built upon it by allowing more aid to be passed to Taiwan. And it happened during the Biden administration also. So it's kind of like a policy favored by Democrats, which is something that the slide doesn't say. And it also established Taiwan as a key non-NATO ally.
And then here's three important ideas to keep in mind for current events in Taiwan or things that have to do with Taiwan. So, first, the Taiwan Strait, which is just like a strip of waterway. It's just like a waterway in between China and Taiwan. It's pretty large. However, most of the US military drills, as well as Chinese military drills, occur in this area as a form of deterrence to either side. And these military exercises along the strait have been increasing in the past few years. Second thing to consider is the Taiwanese market. Despite the threats of Chinese invasion, the stocks in the Taiwan market are booming because of their semiconductor industry. As of now, Taiwan maintains about 90% of semiconductor manufacturing in the world, which, as Riki mentioned, is super important because it's in all of our technology.
Yeah.
Third thing to consider is that there was a new president elected in January of 2024, President Lai, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah. And then going on into like more like geographic stuff, the Taiwan Strait, as you can see in like the picture, it's kind of vague, but the Taiwan Strait is basically the strait where between China and Taiwan, where a bunch of economic trade happens. And it's an air defensive identification zone, also known as the abbreviation ADIZ. And in this strait, there's a lot of tensions between China and Taiwan because China uses gray zone tactics, which is just like military drills that aren't actually invading Taiwan, but it's kind of like threatening them. It's kind of just like bullying Taiwan, but not actually invading them yet. And it's just, yeah, they do use gray zone tactics like every couple weeks or whatever relations get super bad. And then this is also a really good shipping point. As I mentioned, there's a lot of trade that flows through here, approximately $2.45 trillion worth of goods. And then also, these two pictures just show you like where exactly the Taiwan Strait is, and then like how many tactics of gray zone tactics were enabled in this strait, and how much economic and geopolitical goods were traveled through this strait.
Yeah, and so just talk specifically about the trade that we just talked about. The majority of goods that are going to pass through Taiwan is going to be their semiconductor industry. They do also produce iron ore, but it's mainly just like a part of their semiconductor industry, part of the manufacturing process of these technologies that include semiconductors, because that is their main economic motive or
Yeah.
like way to advance themselves. And actually, like, despite the fact that they're afraid of a Chinese invasion, China is their biggest trading partner, considering China is a huge manufacturer of electronics, which needs semiconductors, with the US being the second biggest trade partner. In fact, they are expanding to the United States in the status quo, and actually, some of the biggest semiconductor manufacturers are like creating bases in the United States to drill for REMs or rare earth minerals, which can create these semiconductors, just like they have in Taiwan. So to kind of strengthen our relationship with them. Yeah, semiconductors, they're the largest supplier, 90% of the world's semiconductors. And then the implications of that, for like argumentation's sake, is if China were to invade, trade disruption would lead to billions of dollars in economic loss because obviously trade would be halted in a war. And that's the
Yeah.
picture just shows breakup of their trade.
And then going back onto what we talked about earlier with the president and the new election, the new president, Lai Ching-te, he was just elected in 2024 and he's part of the Democratic Progressive Party. There's two parties in Taiwan, one of them being the KMT, and like the KMT favors more like working with China, and the Democratic Progressive Party, the one that has majority, focuses on Taiwan's own voice and moving away from China. So he has this one China policy that it's a diplomatic statement that recognizes the People's Republic of China as the legal government of China. The policy does not explicitly accept Taiwan as part of China. And his stance on tensions is that it follows the status quo, but does not accept like total subordination of Taiwan. And he emphasizes stability and cooperation, but also bolsters defensive security of Taiwan. So he just wants to like he wants to move away from China, but he doesn't also want to put a strain on relations too much, and just wants to bolster defensive relations, which is a good way to think of him.
And so now we're going to go into specific argument ideas. First, the con. So one possible argument is democracy. Basically, like if the United States leaves the like East Asian region, Taiwan's one of the biggest democratic influences in that region with specific like direct US support. If we leave the region, it would be seen as not supporting democracy, not supporting human rights, kind of giving into China's authoritarianism. And so we included this piece of evidence from CSIS last year telling you that the United States' interest in a healthy, resilient, and confident Taiwan as their foremost supporter of Taiwan's democracy. This would basically just be your uniqueness evidence or what's happening in the status quo. And then you would have to find your own link and impact evidence as to why the affirmative destroys that and why that's bad or losing democracy in the region's bad.
Yeah, and then the next one is trade relations. So, like we've talked about, the US and Taiwan do a lot of trade, and a potential argument you could make is that trade relations get strained if we reduce military support because reducing military support hurts our relations and trade. And then this is a card from, I don't know what the author's date is, but because it doesn't have
Oh
one,
yeah.
it just tells you that semiconductors are the brains of modern tech and they're critical to global competitiveness. And you'd have to find link evidence saying that reducing military support hurts relations, and when relations are hurt, we don't get as many semiconductors.
The reason it doesn't have a date is because it's from like '05. So probably find better evidence, but
Yeah.
I like I found it pretty quickly. So you can probably find
Yeah, you can
something
probably
better.
find better evidence, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then this argument is hegemony. So perceptions of a weak US military. So the way I would interpret the hegemony argument is that when we leave the region, like it's a pretty stock argument that it would be allies. Our allies see us as not supporting Taiwan, not supporting allies, like not defending who we're supposed to be defending, Taiwan, who we've said is like one of our staunchest allies. If we leave the region, it'll be seen as like destabilizing our hegemony on a global scale because our allies will trust us less. And that would not be good, especially
Yeah.
because Kronig 18 writes that by upending the existing balance of power, Beijing will initiate conflict and bring powers into direct conflict. Losing the race to autocratic challengers means nuclear Armageddon. And it's referencing the hedge race. So you
Yeah.
would read
Just
it
it's just
more calm.
basically saying that we're cooked if we leave the region because then China expands its power. I guess.
Yeah, and like you might not want to read this specific piece of evidence. It's not okay. It does say initiate conflict over Taiwan, but this piece of evidence, it's not talking about Taiwan. So don't read it that way. If you're going to read this evidence, read it as just the balance of power shifting. So it is
Yeah.
about hegemony, the US losing hegemony. It's not specific to Taiwan. So don't read it as if it is. But yeah.
And then the next argument is like your classic deterrence argument. And it's just basically saying that through this deterrence, China has pulled back from the China Sea, and the US needs to keep its presence in the region to prevent a Chinese invasion. It's a con argument because it's saying that when we reduce military support, our deterrence is weakened, and then China actually will invade. And there's also like a lot of debate between deterrence and like escalation. So the best way to win these arguments is to clear up the uniqueness battle. And like if you're winning the uniqueness battle on what will happen, then it's pretty easy to control the direction of the links.
So, for instance, this would be your link evidence. But if you wanted to find uniqueness evidence for the deterrence argument, you would say, right now, China's super deterred, everything's perfect. That's why we need to keep the status quo.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
So like if the other team reads evidence saying that China invades in the next year and you guys concede it, it's kind of like your link also goes to crap because then you're not winning that deterrence works right now.
Yep. And then the last possible argument, this is kind of goofy. Like, please don't read this to like your like local lay judge, but if you have a tech round, it's fine. Politics, it's that pulling out of Taiwan would be unpopular with Harris constituents, which would lose her the election. Politics is a pretty popular argument on like every topic, or at least in the past like 2 years, because you can say things like, if Trump gets elected again, it's going to be nuclear proliferation. He's going to
Yeah.
pull out of NATO, like climate change stuff. Like there's a climate change deadline by 2030. So we like need it right now. Like the next presidency matters. And that can be your impact scenario. And then this, it's like not exactly the strongest link, but if you really feel passionately about the politics argument, in fact, CGB
Yeah.
23 writes that 2/3 of Americans say the relationship with Taiwan strengthens national security, and 78% of Americans support supplies to Taiwan. And foreign security is where people are voting. Carnegie 24, this year foreign policy holds importance for voters.
Yeah. I would warn you on reading this argument considering that like in November midterms are gonna happen. So if you have like any decently smart opponent, they're just gonna say that even if she does all this, voters aren't gonna change their votes in like a day because they have to vote pretty soon. So just only run it.
And
Yeah.
early voting is like tomorrow.
Yeah.
So if the majority of her constituents are already going to have voted, but you can say that all the undecideds who are like coming in on like the last day that like Loki don't want to vote, that she needs to win. She needs to win over to win. You can do it at least for like the first half of the month. So
Yeah. And then we're gonna go into the pro world. So these are some pro arguments. So the first one is that it's China th trade, and right now this is like link evidence. Wait, is it link evidence?
yes.
Yeah. So basically, the argument's pretty simple, right? When we reduce military support, our relations with China get better, and then trade with China gets better because relations are better. And this evidence, I'm pretty sure it's just saying that China's against pro-Taiwan legislation. So, like the president of China obstructs trade exchanges with the US, but when you affirm, you decrease pro-Taiwan legislation and trade exchanges become better. It's pretty simple.
It's like this piece of evidence, you could use it as uniqueness or a link of like empirical evidence, but
Yeah.
either way. Like they're pretty much the same because the pros arguing for a change. So you just have to talk about the status quo being bad and link it to the topic, which this
Yeah.
does. So
Yep.
all right. And then the second argument, we talked about deterrence earlier. Escalation is the opposite of that. So, on the uniqueness debate, instead of saying everything's good right now, like we need to keep things the same, you should say, no, everything's bad right now. China's escalating in the status quo. Look to all these military exercises they've been doing in the Taiwan Strait in the past year. It's because they're confident that they can take over Taiwan and they're going to do it. And then you can read this Brookings 24 card. Deterrence given China's increased power is no longer compelling. The danger of an emboldened China lashing out has become substantially greater. And you can read stuff about how like the US being in Taiwan specifically is the reason that China's escalating because they feel threatened by US presence. And you can say invasion bad for the same reasons that deterrence invasion bad.
Yeah. And then another pro argument is like military usage, and it's just basically your simple trade-off argument. And what it's saying is that when we reduce military support of Taiwan, it gives us more political and like military capital to shift to other areas like the Middle East or Ukraine. Because if you didn't know, like all our aid packages kind of get pushed out in one. So it's just saying that when we decrease military support, we increase it for another region. And then this evidence from 2025, even though I don't know what
No, no,
20,
no. It's from 2024. It's predicting
yeah,
2025.
yeah, it's predicting 2025 is basically saying that trade-offs will happen. I'm guessing I haven't read this evidence.
That's all it's saying.
Yeah, it's just saying that trade-offs will happen and that military support will go to other areas.
Yeah, but I wouldn't recommend running this argument considering right now, like all the military equipment we said that was going to Taiwan every year in the status quo, it's actually not. There's like a $20 billion backup that we haven't sent them because we're sending all of the weapons to either Ukraine or the Middle East, which means we're already prioritizing those regions over
Yeah.
Taiwan. So don't
I
run.
wouldn't, yeah, I wouldn't also run this argument because it kind of seems like a counterplan. It's hard to prove that like the probability of this happening is pretty high, right? So I'd warn against it, but you never know.
Like
You can always cook with it.
I would not recommend, especially running Ukraine. I would no, I wouldn't run it. Like it's not a good argument. Don't
Yeah,
run it. It's only here because a lot of people will be running it, so you should be prepared to hit
yeah.
it. But understand the reason why it's bad is because Taiwan is already not being prioritized in the status quo. We're giving all of these weapons, these funds, this military help to Ukraine and to the Middle East in the status quo. Like
Mm.
if you were going to run a trade-off argument, do it for domestic policy, not foreign, which is going to happen in like 2 pages. Okay. And then for another pro argument, Taiwanese dependence. So right now, Taiwan, oh, okay. Okay. I put the evidence here as something different from what this says, but so I guess this can have two arguments. One, Taiwan is too dependent on the US military and pulling out forces them to develop. But the opposite can also be true, which our Bowman 22 evidence tells you US high tech manufacturers are dangerously dependent on Taiwan. And when we pull out, we actually start developing our infrastructure because we have a ton of REMs in the United States that we could be developing into semiconductor manufacturing, which would be good for US jobs, US economic growth. So there's two arguments on Taiwanese dependence.
Yeah. I think the more common one is just gonna be like Taiwan becomes more self-reliant, but like they're just like it's a good argument, but I just say to be careful about the time frame because like if the other team says that China invades in the next 2 years and then you're reading self-reliance, they can like outweigh on time frame and stuff, you know?
This is true. But a fun thing to do would be to concede that whatever, okay. This is like a fun scenario, right? If you're running if you're running ESC and they're running deterrence, just concede deterrence and read Taiwan invasion is actually good for the world, like time frame, whatever. It gets Taiwan invasion good. And then whatever other offense you have, if you win on that, you win the round. Like, because
With
if they just like if you like block out like deterrence with Taiwan invasion good and the judge like doesn't really know what to evaluate at the end of the round because most likely it'll confuse your opponents. If you read Taiwan invasion good, you can probably win off that. But if you
yeah,
can't and it just gets muddy, then the other two arguments, they're most likely going to be reading something that doesn't have like an amazing impact because they're counting on their like ESC or deterrence argument. I don't know, it's like fun. But you probably shouldn't do that. But I just think it's
yeah.
fun.
And then another argument is domestic focus. I don't think this argument's too great, but basically what it's saying is that pulling out is redirecting like military to domestic issues. Like there's a lot of hurricanes happening right now and domestic issues, and it's just basically saying that the US can focus on internal affairs like the election, for instance, or natural disasters. And then what this evidence is saying is that the US would have to weigh its military action versus its like freedom of action in domestic affairs,
Anyway,
pretty much.
yeah. And then, so there's three parts to an argument. We've kind of talked about this. Remember, there's uniqueness. That's the start of your argument, what's happening right now. The link, what changes in the resolution, and then the impact. Why does that change matter? Like, why is that bad or why is that good?
Yeah,
And we explained that for this
yeah.
contention
And
building
then
exercise.
there's like a contention building exercise. My advice to you is take like one of the stock links we've given you and then go like hyper specific on a scenario or an actor. And that's how you get the best arguments. Like, for example, you can make like a trade argument or a relations argument with North Korea or something by saying like improving relations with China improves them with North Korea, and that solves all miscalc in the region or something like that. Just think of some unique arguments. Is my best advice.
Yep. Thank
And
you
then,
for
yeah, I'm
watching.
pretty sure that's
That's
it.
it is.
Yeah, thank you.
So Yay.